The screaming alarm wasn't the loudest sound on the flight deck. It was the silence. Every sailor, mechanic, and pilot aboard the massive carrier froze as a 70,000-pound strike fighter began drifting sideways across the rain-soaked steel. It wasn't taxiing. It wasn't under control. It was sliding, slow enough to give everyone hope, yet fast enough to promise disaster. Only 30 feet remained before the aircraft disappeared into the black ocean below. Inside the cockpit, two naval aviators struggled desperately with dead controls, their frantic voices crackling over the emergency radio. The violent wind drowned out half their words, but nobody needed to hear them to understand the truth. If that jet went over the edge, they were going with it. Chief officers barked orders. Deck crews sprinted toward the aircraft. Heavy chains rattled. Emergency vehicles roared to life. Then, everything failed. The carrier rolled hard beneath another towering wave of soufreau, and the fighter lurched even closer to the edge. One of the securing chains snapped loose with a deafening metallic crack, whipping across the deck like a giant steel snake. Crew members instinctively jumped back. For one terrifying heartbeat, nobody moved, not because they didn't care. Because every person standing there realized they were watching a catastrophe unfold, faster than training manuals could solve it. Among the dozens of experienced sailors stood 19-year-old Noah Carter, the youngest aircraft handler on the deck. Most people barely knew his name. To senior officers, he was the quiet kid who fetched equipment, tightened tie-down chains, and stayed out of everyone's way. Nobody expected him to make life-or-death decisions, least of all himself. Rain soaked through his uniform as he stared at the sliding fighter. His heartbeat pounded louder than the engines. Every instinct screamed for him to obey orders. Every memory from his past begged him to do the opposite. Then Noah noticed something no one else had. Not the aircraft, not the ocean. A tiny mechanical detail hidden beneath the landing gear. His eyes widened. He knew exactly why the jet was sliding, and he knew the standard rescue procedure would send it straight into the sea. He took one step forward. "Stay where you are," a senior officer shouted. Noah didn't answer, because in the next 90 seconds he would have to choose between protecting his career or risking everything to save two strangers. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from. 3 days before anyone on the carrier would know his name, Noah Carter was exactly where everyone expected him to be, working quietly while others took the credit. Long before sunrise, the flight deck came alive. Jet engines growled in the darkness, helicopters thumped overhead, and waves slammed against the steel hull with enough force to make the entire ship tremble. The smell of salt water mixed with jet fuel filled the cold morning air as hundreds of sailors moved with practiced precision. To most of them, Noah was just another junior aircraft handler. At 19, he looked younger than almost everyone around him. His calm personality made him easy to overlook. While louder sailors joked over the radio or argued about football games back home, Noah simply checked tie-down chains one by one, inspected landing gear, and made sure every aircraft was exactly where it belonged. He believed that details saved lives. Unfortunately, nobody else seemed to notice his attention to them. "Hey, Carter," Petty Officer Blake called with a grin. "You're making those chains cleaner than my kitchen?" Laughter echoed across the deck. Another mechanic added, "Relax, those jets aren't going anywhere." Noah smiled politely. "I'd rather check twice than regret it once." The others laughed again before walking away. To them, he was overly cautious. To Noah, caution wasn't weakness, it was responsibility. A few hours later, 2 fighter pilots passed him while heading toward the ready room. One nodded toward the aircraft Noah was inspecting. "Looks good," the older pilot said. "You're wasted crawling around under landing gear." His wingman chuckled. "Leave the flying to us, kid." Neither pilot meant to insult him. They simply saw him as another young deckhand whose job ended where theirs began. Noah watched them disappear inside without saying a word. By afternoon, dark clouds gathered across the horizon. The ocean had been unusually restless all day. The carrier rolled a little harder with every passing hour. Most of the crew barely noticed. They had sailed through storms before, but Noah did. As he knelt beside a parked fighter during his final inspection, he rested his gloved hand against one of the securing chains. It vibrated, not much, just enough to make him pause. He slowly looked across the flight deck. Everything appeared perfectly normal, yet something deep inside him whispered the same warning it had whispered many times before. Something isn't right. He couldn't explain why. He only knew that by this time tomorrow, nothing aboard the carrier would ever feel ordinary again. That evening, after another exhausting shift, the carrier finally grew quiet. Most of the crew gathered in the recreation room, laughing over card games and replaying videos from home. Others called their families before heading to bed. Noah skipped both. He climbed silently into his narrow bunk, pulled the thin curtain closed, and reached beneath his pillow. His fingers found the same object they always did, a weathered leather wristband with a scratched silver flight wing attached to it. It had once belonged to his father. Captain Ethan Carter had been one of the Navy's finest pilots until a routine training exercise turned into a tragedy 16 years earlier. Noah was only 8 when 2 officers knocked on his mother's front door with folded flags and quiet voices. He barely remembered the conversation. He only remembered waiting for his father to come home. He never did. Most children slowly outgrow memories like that. Noah never had. Whenever life became overwhelming, he held the worn piece of leather in his hand, wondering the same question he had carried for years. Would Dad have been proud of me? Or disappointed that I'm still afraid? After his father's death, one man refused to let grief define Noah's future. His grandfather, Walter Carter, a retired Navy flight deck chief with nearly 3 decades at sea. Walter wasn't the type to give emotional speeches. Instead, every summer he took Noah to an abandoned naval training dock along the Gulf Coast before sunrise. While other kids played baseball or slept late, Noah learned lessons few adults ever understood. "Don't watch the aircraft," Walter would say while tying thick ropes around rusted steel posts. "Watch the deck." At first, Noah didn't understand. The deck tells you everything. It whispers before disaster starts. You just have to slow down enough to hear it. Training was relentless, dragging heavy chains across blistering concrete, learning dozens of knots until his fingers bled, calculating weight shifts using nothing but instinct, reading wind direction by watching loose canvas instead of instruments. Whenever Noah made mistakes, Walter never raised his voice. He simply reset everything. Again, one afternoon, exhausted and frustrated, 14-year-old Noah threw a chain onto the ground. "I'll never use any of this." Walter smiled, a quiet smile that carried years of experience. "I hope you're right." Noah frowned. "But if that day ever comes?" The old sailor looked toward the endless ocean. "Someone else's tomorrow may depend on what you remember today." Lying awake aboard the carrier years later, Noah turned the silver wings over in his palm. For the first time in weeks, his grandfather's words refused to leave his mind. Some lessons aren't taught for ordinary days. They're taught for the one day that changes everything. The storm arrived without warning. Just after 3:30 in the morning, the carrier cut through the Pacific like a giant shadow, its bow crashing into waves that seemed taller than buildings. Thick clouds swallowed the moon, leaving only the harsh white deck lights to fight against the darkness. Rain swept across the flight deck in sharp bursts, turning the steel into a mirror of water and oil. Even for seasoned sailors, it was the kind of night that demanded respect. Yet the mission schedule didn't stop. It never did. Ground crews hurried between parked fighters, securing equipment before the weather worsened. The roar of jet engines mixed with the howl of the wind, making every shouted command disappear into the storm. Noah moved carefully from one aircraft to the next, flashlight in hand. His eyes weren't on the sky, they were on the deck. Every vibration beneath his boots told a story. Every groan of the steel hull spoke a language most people ignored. Then he felt it. A strange pulse. It lasted less than a second. Not from the waves, not from the engines, something else. He stopped walking. 20 feet away sat Strike Fighter 214, fully fueled and armed for the morning patrol. At first glance, everything looked perfectly normal. The tie-down chains were locked. The landing gear seemed secure. Maintenance records showed no concerns. But Noah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He crouched beside the aircraft. Rain dripped from the edge of his helmet as he studied the right landing gear. Nothing obvious. No broken bolts, no leaking hydraulic fluid, no damaged tire. Still, the suspension sat just slightly lower than it should. Barely noticeable. So slight that almost anyone would blame the carrier's movement. Noah rested 2 fingers against the steel. The vibration returned. Different this time. Almost like the aircraft was shifting its weight. "Everything good, Carter?" Chief Mason called while walking past. Noah hesitated. I think this gear may be carrying uneven pressure." The chief barely slowed down. In this weather, everything carries uneven pressure. Several nearby sailors laughed. "Kids seeing ghosts again," one joked. Noah forced a smile, but he didn't laugh. His grandfather had once told him, "Disaster never introduces itself. It whispers first." He stood and looked across the deck. The ocean was growing angrier. The carrier rolled farther to starboard than it had all night, then slowly corrected itself. Water rushed across the flight deck before draining away into the darkness. Most of the crew returned to work. Noah stayed where he was. His heartbeat had begun to match the rhythm of the waves. Then it happened. A sharp metallic clink. One tie-down chain on Strike Fighter 214 suddenly lost tension. It wasn't enough for anyone else to notice, but Noah did. His breath caught. The aircraft shifted. Only an inch. Then another. For a terrifying moment, it looked almost alive, as if the storm itself had wrapped invisible hands around 70,000 pounds of steel and decided to drag it toward the edge of the ship. And this time, everyone saw it. The first scream came over the emergency radio. "The aircraft is moving. We've lost stability." Instantly, the calm rhythm of the flight deck collapsed into chaos. Red warning lights flashed across the carrier as sailors sprinted from every direction. The massive strike fighter continued sliding, its tires gliding across the rain-soaked steel as though the deck had turned to ice. "Secure that aircraft. Bring the emergency chains. Move! Move!" Voices collided with the roar of the storm. The ship rolled again. The fighter lurched another 6 feet toward the starboard edge. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Ryan Brooks gripped the controls with white knuckles, while his weapons officer fought through warning messages flashing across every display. "Parking brake isn't responding. Hydraulics are dead. We're drifting." Neither man could stop it. Outside, 6 experienced deck crew members threw heavy chains toward the landing gear. Hooks slammed against steel. Men strained with everything they had. Nothing. The aircraft kept moving. The weight was simply too great. Another violent wave struck the carrier broadside. The entire deck tilted. The fighter suddenly accelerated. Gasps echoed across the flight deck. It was now less than 20 feet from open water. Chief Mason's face lost its confidence for the first time in years. "Pull from the nose," he shouted. The rescue crew obeyed instantly. Steel cables tightened. Engines on the recovery vehicle screamed. For one hopeful second, the aircraft slowed. Then Noah's stomach dropped. No. He saw something everyone else had missed. The damaged right landing gear twisted under the new angle of force. The chief's plan wasn't stopping the slide. It was making it worse. "No!" Noah yelled, louder this time. "Stop pulling!" But his voice vanished beneath the storm. The recovery vehicle kept pulling. The damaged gear groaned. A loud metallic crack echoed across the deck. One of the forward anchor points snapped free. The fighter lurched sideways again. Now only 12 feet remained. The crew froze. No backup plan. No second chance. Just 12 feet, and 2 trapped pilots staring at the ocean through their cockpit windows. Noah felt fear wrapping around his chest. Chief Mason had given a direct order. Junior sailors were never supposed to interfere. If Noah stepped in now and failed, he wouldn't just lose his career. He could kill everyone trying to save the aircraft. His grandfather's words echoed through his mind. The hardest decision isn't choosing between right and wrong. It's choosing between staying silent and speaking when everyone else believes they're right. Noah closed his eyes for one brief second. When he opened them, the frightened deckhand was gone. He wasn't looking at ranks anymore. He wasn't thinking about punishment. He was looking at 2 human beings whose lives were slipping away with every inch that fighter moved. He took a deep breath and began running straight toward the aircraft. "Noah, stop right there." Chief Mason's command cut through the storm like a siren. Every pair of eyes on the flight deck turned toward the 19-year-old sailor running directly at the out-of-control fighter. Rain pounded against his helmet, but he never slowed. The aircraft was still creeping toward the edge, each violent roll of the carrier stealing another precious inch. He skidded to a stop beside the chief, breathing hard. "Sir?" Pulling from the nose won't save it. Chief Mason stared at him in disbelief. "This isn't the time, Carter." "It is the time," Noah replied, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. "The right landing gear isn't just damaged, it's carrying all the lateral stress. Every pound you're pulling from the front is twisting it farther out of alignment. One more hard roll, and it'll shear completely." For a second, nobody spoke. The rain hammered against steel. The wind screamed across the deck. Noah dropped to one knee beside the aircraft, pointing his flashlight beneath the landing gear. "Look at the compression." Several mechanics leaned closer. At first they saw nothing. Then one of them frowned. "Chief, he's right." Another sailor crouched beside them. "The gear's folding inward." Chief Mason's expression changed, not because Noah had challenged him, because the kid was right. "What are you saying?" the chief asked. Noah swallowed. "We're trying to stop the aircraft." He looked toward the ocean. "We should be controlling where it slides." Confused faces surrounded him. "The deck is rolling with the waves," Noah continued. "We can't beat that force, but we can redirect it." He grabbed a grease pencil from his pocket and drew a rough diagram on the rain-soaked steel. "If we reroute 3 emergency chains through the aft deck cleats instead of the forward anchors, we'll spread the load across the carrier instead of the landing gear." One mechanic shook his head. "That's not in the manual." "No," Noah answered. "It isn't." His grandfather had taught him the method years earlier after studying old naval accident reports that most sailors had never even heard of. It was abandoned because almost nobody remembered how to do it. The chief looked at the sliding aircraft, then back at Noah. "Can you?" Noah hesitated only long enough to tell the truth. "I've never done it on a real carrier." The admission hung heavily in the air. Every second mattered. The aircraft slid another foot. Inside the cockpit, one of the trapped pilots looked through the rain-covered canopy, silently watching the young sailor who might be his last chance. Chief Mason closed his eyes for one brief moment, and when he opened them, his decision was made. He pulled off his headset and shouted across the deck. "Everybody listen up." The entire rescue crew turned. "From this moment," he pointed directly at Noah, "you follow his instructions." For the first time in his life, the quiet teenager everyone had overlooked wasn't taking orders. He was giving them. And the next 60 seconds would decide whether they all survived. "Move! Chain Team Alpha with me. Bravo, clear the starboard side. Nobody touches that nose gear unless I say so." For a split second, the flight deck fell silent. Then everyone exploded into motion. Noah wasn't shouting because he wanted authority. He was shouting because hesitation had become the greatest danger on the deck. Rain lashed sideways as sailors dragged thick steel chains across the slick surface. Every step was a fight against the carrier's violent rolling. Lightning flashed across the horizon, briefly turning the dark ocean into a sea of silver before swallowing everything back into blackness. The fighter slid another foot. 30 seconds until the next heavy swell," someone yelled from the bridge. Noah dropped beside the damaged landing gear, ignoring the freezing water soaking through his gloves. He ran his hand across the twisted metal, feeling every vibration. "It's getting worse," one mechanic whispered. "No," Noah answered. "It's telling us where the pressure is moving." He pointed toward 2 deck cleats, nearly 20 feet behind the aircraft. "Run the first chain there, cross the second underneath the fuselage, leave slack until I call for tension." "That's backwards," another sailor shouted. "Exactly," Noah fired back. "We're not trying to pull it back. We're trying to stop it from turning." The crew exchanged uncertain looks. Chief Mason stepped forward. "You heard him. Move." Suddenly, everyone believed. Steel scraped against steel as chains were dragged into position. Hooks slammed into anchor points. Gloves slipped on rain-soaked metal. Every movement had to be perfect. Inside the cockpit, warning alarms screamed without pause. Lieutenant Brooks looked through the canopy at the young sailor directing the operation. "You'd better be right, kid," he whispered. Noah couldn't hear him, but somehow he understood. The carrier rolled violently to port. The fighter jerked toward the ocean. "No tension," Noah shouted. "Wait." The sailors froze, muscles trembling as they held the chains. The aircraft continued sliding. Another inch, another. Some crew members panicked. "We've lost it." "No!" Noah's eyes stayed locked on the damaged landing gear. He wasn't watching the aircraft anymore. He was watching the weight transfer. Then he saw it. Now! Every sailor pulled together. Chains snapped tight with a deafening metallic boom. The aircraft lurched violently. For one hopeful heartbeat, it stopped. Cheers almost erupted. Then came a sound that made everyone's blood run cold. Crack! The weakened landing gear suddenly collapsed another few inches. The fighter slammed sideways, one wheel lifting completely off the deck before crashing back down. A chain burst apart, whipping through the air like a missile. Sailors dove for cover. The aircraft was now hanging partly over open water. Only 2 remaining chains stood between 70,000 pounds of steel and the endless Pacific below. Noah stared at the final anchor point, his heart pounding. He knew the next decision would either become the greatest success of his life or the mistake he would carry forever. The carrier rolled again. This time, it wasn't a gentle sway. It felt as if the entire ocean had slammed its shoulder into the ship. The massive fighter lurched violently toward the edge, its nose hanging over empty space while seawater exploded against the hull hundreds of feet below. One of the remaining chains stretched so tight it sang like a wire about to snap. Every sailor held their breath. Nobody dared move, nobody except Noah. His eyes darted across the aircraft, ignoring the chaos around him. The screaming alarms, the pounding rain, the frantic radio calls, they all faded into the background. He focused on one thing, the pressure. His grandfather had once told him, "Steel always tells the truth. You just have to listen before it screams." Now Noah finally understood what he meant. "The load isn't on the chains," he shouted. "It's on the deck cleat." Chief Mason looked where Noah was pointing. The steel anchor bolted into the carrier's deck had begun to bend under the enormous weight. "If that cleat tears out," Noah yelled, "we lose everything." A stunned silence followed. No one had even noticed. Without waiting for permission, Noah grabbed the last emergency chain from the deck. "Cover me," he shouted. Before anyone could stop him, he sprinted toward the aircraft. "What is he doing?" someone yelled. "He'll never make it." The deck tilted sharply beneath his boots, nearly throwing him to the ground. He caught himself against the aircraft's wing, rain pouring down his face as the Pacific raged only inches away. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Brooks saw the young sailor running straight toward him. "Get back!" he shouted through the open canopy. Noah ignored him. He dropped beside the damaged landing gear, forcing the final chain beneath twisted metal that groaned with every movement. His frozen fingers struggled to lock the hook. It slipped. He tried again. Another violent wave struck. The aircraft shifted. The chain nearly ripped from his hands. "Hurry!" Chief Mason screamed. Noah took one slow breath. Everything around him disappeared. The wind, the rain, the fear. Only his grandfather's calm voice remained. Panic makes your hands weak. Purpose makes them steady. Click. The hook locked. Pull, Noah roared. Every sailor on deck threw their weight into the final line. The chains tightened. The fighter shuddered. Steel shrieked. For one endless second, it seemed impossible to tell whether the aircraft was moving forward or the ocean was pulling it away. Then, the groaning stopped. The chains held. The fighter froze with its front wheel suspended over open water, bounced on the very edge of disaster. Silence swept across the flight deck. Even the storm seemed to pause. One by one, the cockpit canopies opened. The two pilots climbed out with shaking legs. Lieutenant Brooks stepped onto the deck, removed his helmet, and walked directly toward Noah. Without saying a single word, he wrapped the 19-year-old in a firm embrace. Around them, exhausted sailors lowered their heads, some laughing in relief, others wiping away tears they hoped no one would notice. For the first time that night, nobody saw Noah Carter as the quiet kid who checked chains. They saw the man who had refused to let fear make the final decision. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The storm still raged around the carrier. Waves still crashed against its steel hull, and rain still hammered the flight deck. Yet after everything that had happened, the silence felt louder than the chaos. The fighter remained frozen at the very edge of the ship, its nose hanging over the Pacific as if daring gravity to take one more chance. Then the spell broke. Medical team, move in. Secure the aircraft. Damage control to the flight deck. Voices returned all at once, but they sounded different now. The panic had disappeared, replaced by controlled urgency. Sailors rushed back to work, carefully reinforcing the chains while rescue crews escorted the two shaken pilots away from the aircraft. Lieutenant Ryan Brooks stopped after only a few steps. He turned around. Across the crowded deck, he searched until his eyes found Noah. The young sailor stood alone, staring at his trembling hands. The adrenaline that had carried him through the rescue was fading, leaving behind exhaustion so deep he could barely remain standing. Brooks walked back toward him. Without saying a word, he removed the Navy Challenge coin from his own flight suit, a coin every pilot carried as a symbol of trust and brotherhood. He pressed it into Noah's hand. "I've flown combat missions," Brooks said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I've trusted million-dollar aircraft and years of training." He paused. "But tonight," he looked directly into Noah's eyes, "my life depended on a 19-year-old who refused to quit." Noah tried to respond. Nothing came out. Chief Mason approached next. Only hours earlier, he had ordered Noah to stay back. Now the veteran chief stood silently before him for a long moment. "I've been on carriers for 27 years, he finally said. "I've trained hundreds of sailors." A faint smile appeared beneath the rain dripping from his face. "And tonight," he extended his hand, "one of them taught me something." The surrounding crew exchanged quiet glances before something unexpected happened. One by one, mechanics, aircraft handlers, catapult crews, even senior petty officers. They each walked over and tapped Noah once on the shoulder before returning to work. No speeches, no applause, just a simple gesture every sailor understood. Respect. Later that night, after the damaged fighter had finally been secured, Noah stood alone near the carrier's stern. Dawn was slowly breaking across the horizon, painting the endless Pacific in shades of gold and orange. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the old photograph of his grandfather. Looking toward the rising sun, he smiled for the first time in years. "I finally understood," he whispered. The ocean carried his words away, but somehow he believed his grandfather had already heard them. 3 weeks later, the aircraft carrier finally sailed back into San Diego Harbor. The emergency had already become a story whispered across naval bases. Reports had been filed, investigations had been completed. Senior officers had written recommendations for commendations, but none of that mattered to Noah Carter as much as seeing one familiar face waiting on the pier. Walter Carter stood near the end of the dock, leaning on his old wooden cane. Time had added gray to his hair and slowed his walk, but his eyes were exactly as Noah remembered, steady, observant, and impossible to fool. As the crew began reuniting with their families, Noah spotted him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Noah smiled. Walter smiled back. Without a word, they closed the distance between them and embraced tightly. It wasn't the kind of hug shared by heroes returning home. It was the embrace of a grandson who had finally understood the lessons that once felt impossible. After the excitement faded, they drove to the same weathered pier where years earlier an impatient 14-year-old had complained about endless knots, heavy chains, and impossible drills. Nothing had changed. The wooden boards still creaked beneath their feet. Seagulls circled overhead. The salty breeze carried the familiar scent of the sea. Walter sat quietly on the edge of the pier, skipping a small stone across the calm water. "So," he said with a faint grin, "did the ocean finally decide to test you?" Noah laughed softly. I think it did. And? Noah looked across the endless horizon before answering. I used to believe courage meant never being afraid. Walter raised an eyebrow. What do you believe now? I used to believe courage meant never being afraid. Walter raised an eyebrow. What do you believe now? Noah watched another wave roll toward shore. I think courage is hearing fear tell you to walk away, and choosing to step forward anyway. The old sailor nodded. That's the lesson I was hoping you'd discover on your own. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was peaceful. Noah reached into his pocket and held the worn leather wristband that had once belonged to his father. For years, he had carried it as a reminder of someone he had lost. Now it reminded him of something far more important. Not the weight of the past, but the strength it had quietly built inside him. Heroes aren't always the loudest people in the room. Sometimes they're the quiet ones who spend years preparing for a moment they pray never comes. And when that moment finally arrives, they simply choose not to look away. If Noah's journey reminded you that courage often begins with one small step, let us know in the comments. What would you have done in his place? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who believes ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things. Because the next hero the world remembers might be someone everyone overlooked until the moment it mattered most.